Hello and welcome. This is our fourth summer speaker program. I'm Mike Barkey. I'm the executive director for the Door County Environmental Council. Before introducing tonight's speaker, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the DCEC. For over 50 years, the DCEC has been working to preserve and protect our fragile Door County environment. In doing so, we have collaborated with many other environmental groups in Door County. Currently, our focus is on Door County surface water. I'm sure you know Door County has 300 miles of shoreline and upwards of 39 inland lakes and 24 streams. However, recently, according to the Wisconsin DNR Water Quality Report, at least 10 Door County streams in the Bay of Green Bay are impaired or polluted. Contaminants include PCBs, E. coli, and phosphorus, among others. Last year, in 2023, there were 37 beach advisories and 20 beach closures in Door County due to elevated E. coli levels, and it looks like there may be even more events this year. Last year, we worked with UW-Oshkosh professor Greg Kleinheinz and his team to monitor E. coli at more Door County beaches and to monitor more frequently. However, there is also growing concern over the elevated levels of phosphorus in our Door County surface waters. Consequently, this summer, we are again partnering with Professor Kleinheinz, this time to monitor phosphorus levels in water and in the sediment at 7 Door County locations. We would also like to thank Destination Door County and the Archibald Douglas Trust Fund for supporting our summer speaker programs. And if you can also help us to protect our Door County surface water, it would be greatly appreciated. Now I'm pleased to welcome Nate Lawrence, who is the ecosystem scientist at the Savanna Institute in Madison, and where he leads efforts to quantify ecosystem services of agroforestry to validate and improve the performances of specific practices. Originally from Central Illinois, Nate holds a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Iowa State University, where his research focused on soil, greenhouse gas emissions, and nutrient leaching. The title of Nate's presentation tonight is Agroforestry for Water Quality Improvement. Please welcome Dr. Nate Lawrence.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me here to speak tonight. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and get into my presentation. First, I want to point out this beautiful picture, which is from one of our demonstration farms in the Spring Green area. So if you find yourself down in Southwest Wisconsin, please come and visit us. Check out our website. We have events periodically, tours, that sort of thing. It's a pretty fun place to explore. So briefly, in way of introduction, like I already mentioned, I'm from Central Illinois, which makes me a fantastic Illinois being. I feel very welcome here in Wisconsin. Grew up on a small farm, had a few cattle. This is me and my sister, Braveheart and Ellie. Ellie is my sister, Braveheart's the animal. I went to grad school at Iowa State University, where I studied with Stephen Hall, who I'll mention here largely because he's now a new professor at the University of Wisconsin working in the agriculture and water quality improvement area. So my work in both grad school and currently is relevant to this topic of water quality, and I'm excited that Stephen moved here after me, so we'll say Stephen followed me to Madison. I don't think that's exactly what happened, but we can pretend like that's what happened, and great to have him in the state working on this issue as well. My current role, and where I've been for the last 2.5 years, is as the ecosystem scientist at the Savanna Institute, again, based in Madison, Wisconsin, focused on the climate, water quality, and biodiversity impacts of agroforestry. So agroforestry might not be a word that you're terribly familiar with. We're going to table this idea for a few slides while we set up kind of a conceptual framework and understanding fundamentals of water quality impacts that we're going to be going over today. We're going to revisit agroforestry about halfway through the presentation, and at that point, we'll all get on the same page as to what this word means. So first of all, what do I mean for water quality in the context of this presentation? We will be focused on nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus. So Mike mentioned several water quality issues as we started our conversation today. including phosphorus. We're going to focus on the nitrogen phosphorus side. This is the nexus where agriculture, one of the ways that agriculture impacts water quality locally, regionally, and really kind of around the world. So why phosphorus and why nitrogen? Let's first look at some data, since I'm a scientist and we like to present big plots with lots of dots on them. So this is 4 different plots of stream health indices, specifically biotic stream health indices, as they relate to the phosphorus and nitrogen concentrations in a whole bunch of Wisconsin streams. So every dot you see up there is one stream site that was monitored for a prolonged period. They measured, this is from the USGS report. The citation got cut off here, but a USGS report that measured nitrogen and phosphorus content, as well as phytoplankton and water clarity that we're showing here. And we can see pretty clear relationships that as either nitrogen or phosphorus increase, the phytoplankton goes up. That means more green stuff in the water. And simultaneously, we see a reduction in water clarity. The same report looked at fish communities. They looked at macroinvertebrate communities, and they found similar relationships with thresholds that above a certain quantity of nitrogen or a certain quantity of phosphorus, they saw those biotic indices. So how healthy is the fish community, which fish are actually present. Some of those indices started to go down after a certain level. Some are more sensitive to nitrogen, some are more sensitive to phosphorus, but they're both issues that have similar downsides for stream communities. And how about humans? Well, you've probably all seen this picture before. This is from 1999, an algal bloom in Green Bay. So we can see the Fox River pouring into Green Bay at the southern end of Green Bay, and then a huge plume of green. Most of that green is being fueled by the amount of nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, that are being delivered to that water body by the Fox River as it empties into the southern part of the bay. Depending on which algae are present there, you can have several different issues, one being cyanobacteria, which can create toxins that are dangerous for people. And then another kind of human health impact we'll look at briefly here is nitrate, so a form of nitrogen in private drinking water wells. This is a map of the percentage of private drinking water wells that exceed 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate nitrogen. This is a limit set by the EPA. They say above this, we're getting into unsafe territory for drinking water for humans. And we can see across basically the southern 2/3 of Wisconsin, it's pretty common for drinking water wells to exceed that 10 milligram per liter suggested limit. Sometimes they exceed that limit by a huge margin. So I've seen values of 50 ppm nitrate, and which is of course five times the recommended limit. But that's pretty common across the southern 2/3 of Wisconsin, including even here in southern Door County particularly. So where are all these nutrients coming from? We'll go back to the stream study, all of these studies of Wisconsin watersheds. And now we'll look at phosphorus on top, nitrogen on bottom, and the percent watershed in food production on the x-axis. So the percent of the watershed in food production was a pretty good predictor of total phosphorus and nitrogen content in watersheds. You see some clustering around 0. These are mostly from streams that are either very far north in Wisconsin, where there's very little food production land, or a couple of them are actually from urban watersheds as well. But for the most part, we have streams that have some composition of ag land, and that's a pretty good predictor of total nutrients. The next study we'll go through here looked at the US portion of the Great Lakes watershed, which of course includes Door County, parts of Wisconsin, all of Michigan if you look across the lake. So non-point nitrogen and non-point phosphorus, 2 different sources of nutrients that don't come out of pipes. We'll talk about what comes out of a pipe on the next slide. And basically we can see that the highest rates of non-point nitrogen and phosphorus pollution are also in these highly agricultural landscapes, mapping very well to the last study that we looked at streams. So where are these nutrients actually coming from in terms of sources? This is a percent applied nutrient, nitrogen on the left and phosphorus on the right. And really, we can think of this as anthropogenic nutrients. So all the nutrients that are coming from humans that are going on the landscape, where are those actually, what actually embodies those nutrients? Where are they coming from? So manure is the biggest source in the Great Lakes watershed of anthropogenic nutrient inputs. It makes up less than half of nitrogen or phosphorus, but pretty close to half of phosphorus, and a pretty good chunk of all nitrogen is manure inputs in this US portion of the Great Lakes watershed. Next up, if we go up to the next color here, is chemical agricultural fertilizer. So chemical fertilizers are pretty dominant depending on where we are in the watershed. Next, you'll see a lighter shade of nitrogen fixation. So some plants, as you're probably familiar with, can actually supply some of their own nitrogen. Alfalfa is famously good at this. Soybeans are reasonably good at it as well. And that's another source of nutrients we're putting out on the landscape. Some of it stays in the plant, some of it doesn't, and could be a source of pollution effectively. And then atmospheric deposition, what falls out of the sky. There's several different forms that can fall out of the sky in. I'll note that a lot of that atmospheric deposition is because of human activities. So things that we're doing that increase the amount of nutrients in the atmosphere one way or another means there's more nutrients coming out of the atmosphere. And then finally, we have chemical non-ag fertilizers, septic systems, and point sources. So these are things like sewage treatment plants, septic field, of course, fertilization that's applied to lawns or golf courses, that sort of thing. So that's all of the pink and red right up at the very top. And these are not zero. These values, they do show up on the stacked plot that we're looking at here, but they are very small in these watersheds as kind of a total proportion of nutrients. Those are pretty small compared to the other ones. So finally, we can then map, are there places in the US portion of the Great Lakes watershed where one of these sources of nutrients is dominant? We can see in eastern Wisconsin, there are large areas where manure is the dominant source of nutrients. It's probably not the only, it's certainly not the only, even in those areas where it's dominant, but it is far and away the largest source of nutrients. And then in Door County, in a lot of Wisconsin, we see a shade of kind of yellowish orange that indicates a mixture of manure and fertilizer inputs. In some parts of Wisconsin, we also have fertilizer-dominated inputs where fertilizer far exceeds manure. But all of these ag sources of nutrients are fairly dominant in terms of what's going out into this watershed in the first place. So quick recap. Excess nitrogen and phosphorus present a huge challenge for Door County, the Great Lakes, Wisconsin, the Midwest, and many other agricultural regions of the world. So we looked at the algal bloom at the mouth of the Fox River in Green Bay. There was a study a few years ago that looked at the mouths of major rivers around the world and found 400 hypoxic zones on every single continent except for Antarctica. So Antarctica is pretty good. You want to get rid of this problem, you can move there. It's not a big deal there. But all the other continents had areas of hypoxia. Most of them were contributed mostly by human activities, if not entirely by human activities. And the size of the hypoxic zone, they were typically a lot larger in areas that had a lot of agriculture. Areas that didn't have a lot of agriculture didn't necessarily have them at all. But 400 hypoxic zones around the world is a lot. So we're going to switch gears a little bit now to a conceptual model for nutrient losses. So a conceptual model is a way to visualize something that's very complicated and try to simplify it down to the point that we can kind of visualize and think about how this system might work. So we're going to create a conceptual model here for the food producing landscape. So we have a bucket, and we'll add leaks to the bucket and inputs to the bucket and think about how this relates to nutrients. So we can think about nutrients as water in the bucket, nutrient inputs as water being added to the bucket, first we'll think about a natural ecosystem. So what would have existed here, we'll say 200 years ago. And that would be only inputs that were natural. We can sort of define them as nitrogen's probably mostly coming from a few nitrogen fixing plants. Phosphorus is mostly coming from weathering of primary minerals in the soil. So actually soil formation processes that are releasing phosphorus. These tend to be infinitesimally small sources of nutrients on a kind of an acre year basis. They're really, really small amount of nutrients coming to natural ecosystems. There's quite a bit of nutrients contained within the soils and vegetation of those ecosystems. And then there is a little bit that is lost to the environment, or maybe exported to aquatic environments, even in a natural ecosystem, typically at extremely low rates. So let's say we come into this system and we try to add agricultural harvest. So we try to plant something, a crop, a forage, harvest it, and remove it from a field or a landscape. If that's all we do, and we try to bring in pretty significant sort of agricultural harvest, then the quantity of nutrients on the landscape will drop, and the harvest will no longer be able to be sustained. This is actually what happened during the wheat expansion. So whenever wheat was being grown in the 1800s, there was kind of a big expansion of wheat. They didn't use a whole lot in the way of inputs. They didn't really manage things sustainably. They just came in, plowed up ecosystems, took advantage of the nutrients that were there for a few years. Yields would tank. They'd move on to the next, move further west and further north and find more fertile soils, rinse and repeat the process because they couldn't be maintained for very long. So in most modern agricultural systems, we maintain harvest by applying nutrients inputs, typically at rates many, many times greater than the natural ecosystems would have provided to the unharvested system. Unfortunately, this also tends to increase our losses. So losses being what's going to the aquatic environment, some in nitrogen also could be lost to the atmosphere. Phosphorus is mostly probably being lost to the aquatic environment. But as we add more, in order to be able to harvest more, we also tend to lose more. So what can we do to reduce losses? And there's a huge amount of emphasis that's put on just turning down the spigot that's being lost to the environment. And I think that is a perfectly good place to start. It's also, I think, a good idea to kind of play out the conceptual model. What if that's the only thing that we do? We do something that just reduces that environmental loss and nothing else. Then the amount of nutrients that are stored on the landscape will increase, and eventually will probably increase to the point that they'll find some other way to be lost from the environment. So for example, if you look at phosphorus loss from a watershed and you plot that across the quantity of phosphorus in the soil, they're pretty predictive. As the phosphorus in the soil goes up, phosphorus losses also tend to go up. And eventually you get to the point that you're losing quite a bit. So if we just turn down the losses, we're going to put something out on the landscape. It's going to stop the losses. We're not going to do anything about changing harvest or input rates. Eventually, we probably end up with this imbalance problem, and those nutrients will likely eventually find a way to move once again. So ultimately, I think we need to start thinking about ways to reduce environmental losses and then use that as an opportunity to reduce inputs. This is a more efficient food system. We still have harvest. We're losing less to the environment. We're using the fact that we're losing less to the environment to apply less nutrients in the first place. And then this is a balanced system that can go on for a very long time. There are probably some systems that just have super high nutrient inputs where you could turn down the amount of nutrients going into the system. You'd reduce losses without impacting harvest at all. So these would be systems with nutrient inputs above what we might call the agronomic optimum, where a quantity is being applied that is more than the crop is actually really taking advantage of to increase yield. But there are also probably instances where reducing inputs may actually slightly reduce harvest while reducing losses. So depends on the field and the farm, I think it's safe to say, but there are probably farms you can reduce inputs and maintain the same amount of yield and reduce losses. That's sort of the over fertilization phrase that I hear sort of quite frequently. There are also probably a lot of instances where reducing inputs would reduce yield somewhat. And I think it's worth thinking about harvest as something that we can plausibly change. So do we need the 171 bushels per acre? Is it acceptable for some farm to produce 150 bushels per acre? If it were, then that would be we could probably maintain that with much lower environmental losses. But that's going to require change at a societal level, right? To make that possible for someone to be able to do that and keep farming, perhaps. So I think it's worth noting that harvest maybe doesn't have to be fixed exactly where it is right now, but if we want to change how much we're getting from the landscape, we're going to need to think about changing how we eat and kind of these big questions that impact all of society would take a pretty big effort. So if we reduce losses, reduce inputs, then, oops, going backwards here. Then we can have a more efficient food system that's sort of losing less. So let's move on to agroforestry and the Savanna Institute. So this is the Savanna Institute as of last fall. We just had our new retreat photo about a week ago, but didn't make it into this presentation. So we're a group that's focused on catalyzing the development and adoption of a resilient, scalable agroforestry. We have several different teams working to help make this happen. We have an adoption team that works with people interested in planting agroforestry, in how do you do it, how do you get funding to do it, what are all the nuts and bolts that you need to be considering. We have a demonstration network of farms in Wisconsin and Illinois that are showing people what agroforestry can look like, what agroforestry looks like when it's out on the landscape. Communications team, getting the word out to everyone. A commercialization team, making sure that if we are producing something new on the landscape, a new crop, for instance, there's actually somewhere for that crop to go, a market for that crop to be sold into. And then finally, a research team that includes myself, which is working on both tree crop breeding, expanding the number of options that people have for crops that they can grow, and then my role, ecosystem science, as well as a couple of others. So let's get to what is agroforestry anyway. Our executive director uses a phrase that agroforestry is farming with trees on purpose, which is kind of intentionally vague, but demonstrated or illustrated here in this image in several different capacities. So we have trees and livestock systems, trees and riparian buffers, trees integrated into cropping systems, and we can look at what each of these things might be called. So the integration of trees, pasture, and livestock managed in a single system we call silvopasture. So this is an illustration of what that looks like. This is a picture of what that could look like actually on the landscape on one of our demonstration farms. Alley cropping is the cultivation of crops in alleys between rows of trees or shrubs. An image of what that can actually look like on the landscape from one of our demo farms. Windbreaks you're probably somewhat familiar with, strips of trees and shrubs designed to enhance crop and livestock production while providing conservation benefits. Here I'll take an image from South Dakota where they have some pretty impressive windbreaks already deployed on the landscape. And riparian buffers, strips of permanent vegetation along a stream, lake, or wetland. Riparian buffers are typically designed specifically for their water quality benefits. And an image of what that can actually look like on the landscape. So back to our what is agroforestry question, and I think now maybe you'll see the rationale of the trees on farms on purpose definition. A lot of different ways you can think about having more trees or shrubs on the landscape, but in all of these instances, the trees or the shrubs are playing some role in the farming enterprise. So not exactly just a woodlot next to a farm that's unmanaged, but actually trees incorporated into the landscape and more creative, more intentional ways. So what could that mean for water quality? As we transition a landscape from an annual dominated system, which you might see here on the right, it's worth remembering that here in Wisconsin, our annual crops grow for 4 to 6 months out of the year, which means for 4 to 6 months out of the year, they more or less look like this image on the right. There's very little green on the landscape to hold nutrients in place, very little to hold soil in place. So we can have very high losses, especially in some of those periods when there's nothing actually growing on the landscape. And as we transition to a more perennial system, we have more vegetation on the landscape year round. We have more holding soil in place. We have roots that are in the ground 24/7, 365, holding more of those nutrients in place. So a few studies that actually looked at water quality in an agroforestry context. The first is a study from Missouri that looked at an alley crop. So this study site planted strips of trees into a row crop context. This was a corn soybean system. We can actually look at what it looks like on the next slide, but there was a control watershed where nothing happened, an agroforestry watershed, and a grass strip watershed. This is what that actually looks like in real life. This picture is from 2015, about halfway through the study, so you can see the trees starting to become pretty obvious in the satellite imagery. And over the full course of a 25-year study, the primary author on many of these papers, Ranjith Udawada, and his team found 25 and 23% reduction in surface nitrogen and phosphorus losses, with about 15% of the land taken out of production in order to plant this alley crop system. You can see little huts at the base of each of these watersheds that they use to actually measure all of the water leaving the site, and this was averaged over a very long period. So we can go back to our conceptual model and think about how this site actually worked. What did it do? And what did adding those strips of trees actually do on the landscape? And for one, they slightly reduced inputs and harvest, right? Because we took about 15% of the total landscape out of production. Over the course of this study, we probably would expect to see about a 15% reduction in both inputs and harvest from taking that land out of production. But they saw an even greater reduction in nutrient losses. And the balance of that is probably taken up or retained in the soils and vegetation of the system. So the trees themselves they contain a pretty large amount of nutrients. Those perennial strips of vegetation also helped probably filter particulate nutrients. So basically soil erosion, hold it on the landscape, keep it there, and keep it from being lost. The next data that I'll present is from a preliminary study. So this is going to be year 1 of what will ultimately be a 3-year study that we did on some of our farms, where we installed resin lysimeters. These are pretty simple instruments that they work kind of like a water softener. They actually have a resin in them that's very similar to a water softener. We fill up a kind of a funnel with this resin buried in the ground. And then any water that moves downward through the soil that infiltrates after big rain events goes through that resin, and all of the nutrients get sorbed out. We come back a year later, dig it up, extract the resin, and we see what's there. So we're looking at nutrient leaching here, downward migration of nutrients with excess water after big rain events and through soil. Our field site compared a corn silage system that was adjacent to a field that we just planted young hazelnuts into. And when I mean young, in this case, I mean really young, like they were about 6 inches tall at the beginning of this study. And I'd mentioned this is year 1 of the study. This is all ongoing. So this is year 1. We'll have more data here soon. The hazelnuts had rows of trees, and the nutrient management varied across the system. So to take that into account, we put these resin lysimeters in different locations in the hazelnuts and in the corn silage, denoted by the red dots. So corn silage, they were spread out to kind of represent the same total spatial area as our hazelnut site. Nothing too complicated there. That means all the treatments in the corn silage were just corn silage. But in our hazelnut site, because the trees didn't occupy 100% of the site yet, we put in 3 lysimeters per tree in this arrangement, where one is right underneath the tree. Again, tree is kind of generous when they're 6 inches tall, but they'll someday be trees. One in between, but in the row. So we'll call this a row core, and then one in between the 2 actual rows that we'll call the alley. The reason why I'm stressing this so much is because the inputs varied across these different sites. So in the silage system, we had both manure and fertilizer inputs. In the rows that the hazelnut or the row lysimeter were underneath had organic composted chicken manure. And then the entirety of the hazelnut side was in an alfalfa system a year prior. So remember the nitrogen fixation that alfalfa can bring into a system. This would have still been benefiting, or a lot of that nutrient, particularly nitrogen from alfalfa, would still have been present on this site. So the whole of the hazelnut system had some nutrient input from that nitrogen fixing plant. So we're going to look at nitrate leaching here. This is preliminary data, so we'll keep the units off and put those on later whenever we publish. But we can see that silage corn had the highest rates of nutrient leaching of any of the 3 sort of systems that we looked at. Hazelnuts and also the cores in the rows of the hazelnut, so either beneath the tree or between 2 trees, had a lower but still elevated quantity of nitrate leaching. And in the nitrate leaching in the alleys, so between the rows of trees where there were no additional inputs other than being an alfalfa a couple of years earlier, we saw the lowest rate of nitrate leaching of the systems that we looked at. If we take the actual aerial extent, so we say the row takes up about 1/4 of this landscape, the alley takes about 3/4 of this landscape, the young hazelnut field reduced nitrate leaching by about 63% compared to the adjacent corn silage field. So we can go back to our conceptual model. This is maybe what we might think of the silage field: pretty high inputs, high harvest, high losses. And in our brand new hazelnut system, we reduced inputs quite a bit in this very young field. Losses were also reduced. 1-year-old hazelnuts don't produce anything. They're in their establishment phase. So I think the real challenge will come whenever these actually start to become productive. And then we'll start running into the potential trade-off of how do we manage these plants to be productive, to produce a lot of hazelnuts, while also hopefully reducing losses compared to the silage corn system. So this monitoring is all continuing, and this year we'll actually have harvest. And then finally, we'll go on to riparian buffers. Riparian buffers, because they're planted for water quality improvement, have been studied much more for water quality improvement than a lot of other agroforestry systems. So we actually have meta-analyses, studies of studies. So a study will summarize the findings of, let's say, 50 or 75 different studies into the water quality impacts of riparian buffers. And on average, found a 68 and 51% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus, respectively, for temperate riparian buffers planted and then studied for their impact. So pretty huge reduction for this practice that was explicitly designed to reduce nutrient losses. Finally, riparian buffers from our conceptual framework. So slightly reduce nutrient inputs, right? The riparian buffer does have a footprint. So if we plant a riparian buffer where there was none, we're slightly reducing the footprint that we're actually farming on. So slightly reducing inputs and very slightly reducing harvest. It would depend on the footprint of the actual riparian buffer and how big that was compared to the total field. And then most of those nutrients are staying in the soil or vegetation of the riparian buffer, particularly phosphorus, which has nowhere else to go. It is worth noting that in some studies of very old riparian buffers, in places where there were very high phosphorus losses, they became less effective decades after they were planted because we had this problem where the soils and vegetation of the riparian buffer would become saturated in phosphorus. They can't actually take up anymore. And then it would start continuing to kind of go downstream. So in kind of summary, both nitrogen and phosphorus, primarily from agriculture, are a major source of water quality issues in our region and in many agricultural regions around the world. The most durable solutions will consider how they change inputs, storage, harvest, and losses. So inputs, what's coming into the system, storage, how much water is in the bucket, harvest, how much are we removing whenever we take crops or forage off the landscape, and also losses. And as we think about addressing water quality issues in agriculture, it would be very challenging to only impact one of those things in a way that was kind of durable, a lasting solution for improving water quality. So please join us. We have monthly stream monitoring near our Spring Green campus. Is actually on one of our farms. We have a bunch of other events. So check out our website at savannainstitute.org for more events. Also, please check out our perennial farm gathering. If you're interested in hearing more, that'll be October 6th to October 8th in Madison. And I will finally say, because I forgot to put it on the slide, the preliminary data I shared was funded by the Grantham Institute. So we'll thank our funders as well. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Nate, very much. I have another microphone and I need some exercise, so I'm happy to run from one question to another so we get it on our recording. Anybody want to take a shot first off?
Sorry, I have two questions.
Go for it. I think we have plenty of time, so we've got 20 minutes.
Okay. So the first one is, I'm from Switzerland, as my accent probably indicates. I'm here on vacation. I was interested in the subjects, so that's why I came. In Switzerland, it's very different from your area here near the Great Lakes, in the sense where the impact of climate change is much greater. So the farming activities are suffering right now. And probably you don't have the same experience yet, but my first question was, is agroforestry somehow a solution for adapting agricultural production to climate change and resisting to droughts and at the same time also floods, which farmers are suffering from in Switzerland?
Yeah, great question. Climate adaptation can probably play out in a few different ways. So I'll try to tick through a couple, but I'm not going to try to do an exhaustive list. But how can trees and agroforestry help us prepare for a climate future that's coming? And I'll give a couple examples of that. One of the reasons people are interested in silvopasture, one of the primary reasons they come to us and they say, I'm interested in planting trees into a pasture, and getting more trees into pasture systems, is for the shade that the trees can provide. So that can provide both some element of protection against really extreme temperatures for the livestock, and it can also mean that the forage that's grown under the trees grows better through droughts and hot weather than forage that's not grown under trees. So cool season grasses do better in really hot and dry conditions if they have a little bit of shade. So that's both keeping livestock cooler to begin with and making sure that their food, forage, is actually productive through hotter and drier weather that we're seeing in our summers here. Another example, and this one's been somewhat quantified in a lot of perennial systems, a little bit less in trees, but as we perennialize the landscape, we can increase what we call infiltration. So the quantity of water that can be taken up by the soil in a given period of time. Annual production systems, frequent tillage tend to promote soils that are not very receptive to really big rain events. So when we get one of these enormous downpours that we're seeing more and more of, more of that water runs off the landscape and more of it runs off the surface and runs off quickly, which means the entire watershed is receiving that pulse of water more quickly. So if we can manage through things like perennializing some portion of the landscape to get more of the water to soak in on the landscape, that means it's running off, at the very least, it's running off less quickly. Ideally, less of it's running off to begin with. And so perennialization is pretty effective at increasing the amount of water that can be taken up by watersheds. So a couple ways that perhaps agroforestry can help prepare for climate change. There's another area of my research of how agroforestry can help solve climate change on kind of the emission side of things too. But hopefully those are illustrative examples.
Okay, thank you very much. My second question was about water quality. You're talking about nutrients, and I realize it's a very important thing for water quality. But in Switzerland, we also have a big problem with pesticides in water. Usually when you find phosphorus and nitrogen in water, you also have pesticides. And actually we are a population of about 8 million people. And recently 1 million of those 8 millions had tap water that was over the limit of the legal limit of the European Union for pesticides. So basically we had 1 million people with non-legal drinkable water. The pesticides limit was passed. Did you look into this or not yet?
Yeah, not obviously for this presentation, I didn't present any of it, but there is research on different strategies for reducing pesticides in water. And so riparian buffers have been studied in this context. And it depends a little bit on the pesticide. So there are pesticides that leave fields in different forms. And some of them are really effectively trapped by some management practices. Other ones require sort of different solutions. But there are studies on riparian buffers and how they can reduce pesticides in watersheds. And they're very, very effective at some types of pesticides, and then other types of pesticides somewhat less so. Particularly sediment-bound pesticides. So if it's stuck to soil and you're reducing how much soil is washing off the site, so the water that's washing off of a farm field is clear instead of brown, and if the pesticide is attached to that sediment, then it can be trapped out really, really effectively, like with, efficiencies very, very, very high. Other types of pesticides are water soluble, which is a little bit trickier. It means that even if you trap the soil and you keep the soil on the landscape, they may or may not actually remove water soluble pesticides, because those tend to go where the water goes. But that's a little bit of an oversimplification. And I can send you a guide written by a couple of colleagues that looked at riparian buffers and their impacts on a whole bunch of things, including pesticides. So it could give you a lot more specific information.
So can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So here in Door County, particularly southern Door County and Kewaunee County just below, our CAFOs are trying to convince us that everything's good. We are seeing that buffer zones are not, I think the EPA suggests a minimum of a 60-foot buffer zone from riparian shores, and we don't have that. And it sounds to me like a agroforestry concept that would maybe spread out there is an excellent idea. Hard to sell, I would say. How can we convince our agricultural industries here that this can really be an answer to a lot of this karst topography problems.
Yeah, yeah, big question. And I think, you know, sometimes when I think about the sort of big question of how agroforestry is actually going to get out on the landscape, I look at who I'm working with and who are the other colleagues, who are the other teams that people who have been at this a lot longer than I have brought on to work on this topic. And so I think you can look at, you know, the organization, hopefully Savanna Institute is getting something right with having teams focused on plant breeding to commercialization, helping people to get through the adoption process, helping them to get conservation funding if that's available, helping them implement it, making sure there's a market for that product at the downstream side. And I think if you, some combination of all of those things should be some level of successful on the landscape. So from an ecosystem service side, you know, there's a lot of interest in how do we manage landscapes to do better by things like climate and water quality and biodiversity. And there are communities and populations that are currently seeing the impacts of our food production system in some negative ways because of things like impaired water quality. So how can we make sure this whole system is working better, that there's some combination of incentives that get people to change their practices, even just a little bit, if it can make a big impact for downstream communities, for instance. And I'm cautiously optimistic that some of that is headed in a more positive direction, that there will be more meaningful incentives to do this sort of thing for any given farmer or landowner to adopt something to improve water quality impacts, because it's going to make sense for their bottom line, because someone will pay them more for the product that they're producing, or that they'll get an incentive for, you know, adopting a additional incentive for adopting a practice beyond sort of the existing incentives that exist. And I'm hopeful that some of these can work a little bit, but I think there'll be a trial and error process, and it'll be a, you know, it'll be something. There are some, you know, windbreaks. I drove up from Madison and I saw windbreaks most of the drive here from Madison, many that are 100 years old. So it's not like there's no history of success or change, but there's certainly a long way to go.
Nate, we have a question in the chat room here from someone online, and I think it fits in pretty well here. Does the U.S. Farm Bill support these practices? How can the U.S. Farm Bill be improved to encourage more agroforestry practices on the landscape?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have a policy working group that's a bunch of people at Savanna Institute and a bunch of people who work in agroforestry policy specifically who aren't at Savanna Institute. You can look up the Agroforestry Coalition if you want to see some of their work. Yeah, some aspects of the Farm Bill do support some agroforestry practices, certainly conservation-oriented practices. A lot more could be done. And yeah, if they want to read more about that, the professionals in the policy space can speak to that as well.
I was wondering if you noticed on your farm, if after you planted your trees and planted a crop alongside, did you notice any reduction in productivity because of the shade of the trees?
That is an excellent question. I'm really glad you asked. Right now, the trees that we've planted on our demo farms, Savanna Institute's only 10 years old in total. Most of our demo farms are more like 3 or 4 years old. So we haven't gotten to the point that we can actually characterize this kind of full competition impact, because we don't have big trees. We have small trees, and small trees probably don't have the same impact. There's a project that we're going to be engaging with on some level in the near future where we look at windbreaks. Again, some windbreaks, many windbreaks are about 100 years old, and yield maps. And the yield maps that people get from their combines that can show how does yield change over an entire field. We can look at how it changes next to a windbreak, both in the area where the crops are getting shaded and in the area where the crops are potentially benefiting from reduced wind speed. So we're about to start studying this sort of in earnest with the existing sites that we have, which again, in this case is going to be windbreak focused. And then as our trees on our farms actually mature and we start getting those, shade impacts, we'll be quantifying that as well. But yeah, great. How do trees and crops and livestock all actually get along is a whole set of great questions that we're going to be exploring very, very carefully.
This is great. Thanks for being here. Yeah, this is exciting to learn a lot, and obviously it's got a lot of relation to our world up here that's pretty ag. There's a nonprofit here that's been reasonably successful on working with farmers on what is I think there's a lot of grants out there for cover crops, perennial agriculture. I think it's interseeding, like smarter kind of ways of farming to keep most of the fields green most of the time, and large acreage and kind of that group I think can properly brag for a lot of water cleanliness, and just getting a lot of people that weren't even thinking about it to do it. Thinking about agroforestry is kind of I call it the next level. Love to know your thoughts on on practicality questions. So there might not be a lot of, it sounds like from the other answer to the question, there might not be a lot of grant money and maybe as much incentive for those as some of those practices that some of the farms in Kiwani have taken advantage of. But if there's not, of all these practices, which seem like lowest hanging fruit, either on the different types, some seem like a lot harder to put trees in the middle of the field. But yeah, which practices, whether it's alleyway or tree, the windbreaks or anything like that, which and tree types or the types of agroforestry, which seem like lowest hanging fruit, easiest to convince farmers to try, in which, which we could work on in the conservation world to get more trees and more education. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, first I'll say there are certainly a number of programs to support adoption of agroforestry. I'm not sure how that compares to something like cover crops. I imagine in total number of dollars in Wisconsin, it's probably a lot lower, but the number of acres is also a lot lower. So the per acre value, there are certainly incentives and several different pathways and grant programs that people can explore if that's something they're interested in. As to the kind of lowest hanging fruit question, I think if we had a perfect answer to that, we would probably focus only on that and not do the other things that we're doing. I think that if there's an area where a certain kind of resource concern is really dominant, then solutions that address that resource concern might have more what we'll maybe call scaling opportunities than others. So whenever I think of a landscape where water quality is a very clear issue, where the impacts of water quality are being felt by the local community, certainly riparian buffers can do a lot. Now, the next question there becomes riparian buffers are not unheard of. There's quite a lot of them in Wisconsin. They're not exactly normal practice on every single stream. And certainly as you get to smaller and smaller streams, they become, less frequent. So there could be intermittent streams that only show up after big rain events that are really big problems, and that probably don't have buffers protecting them. I think one of the questions that I will be digging into is how do trees impact how riparian buffers perform compared to riparian buffers that don't contain trees, that are just grasses and herbaceous plants. And there's already a few sites that are looking into this across the Midwest. But if we can show that trees make buffers work better, then I think we can make a very compelling case for why trees should be included in more riparian buffer plantings. And a practice that can reduce nutrient loss by 50+% with a pretty small portion of the landscape actually changing production methods is something I'm, really excited by. There are also practices that are not sort of strictly conservation oriented. So something more like tree crops or silvopasture systems. These are systems that still have production. And so there might be inroads for a tree crop in a way that, conservation practices, edge of field practices, things like windbreaks, riparian buffers might have kind of one way that they get adopted. And then something like a tree crop or a food livestock production system that incorporates trees that might have kind of an appeal to a different set of stakeholders and might have a different sort of reason for adoption. But I think that there's probably opportunities for pretty much everything that I described today, and which opportunities make the most sense for a given farm to do first probably depends on the farm and the landscape.
Great. One follow-up. Any tree types that come to mind? I know we're a little bit different area than where you are most of the time, but say our temperate forest areas up here, any tree types that are what you guys have found in research the most effective? I know it depends on a million things, but if there was a list of 5 trees that you guys think about a lot, whether it's on the edge of a field or in a field.
Yeah, a lot of the people who are planting agroforestry right now are planting native species that are native to their county. So that list of 5 would probably look like 5 trees that people plant in conservation practices in Door County. And then some trees are being planted out for a combination of conservation and timber benefits. So there's probably some overlap there, right? Some of our high value timber trees are also native trees as well. And then trees that have food products that people can eat. And some of those also might be native. So yeah, rather than answer 5 species, I'll answer 3 things we might want from trees: conservation benefits, food value, timber value, and that food benefit also could be food for livestock. So some trees either drop something that livestock can eat, or they themselves can be eaten by livestock when nothing else is available. But a few different modes of like, how do you think of intentionally integrating trees on the landscape? Species vary a lot. And I don't know that there's 5 species we plant dramatically more than others, but there are some trees that come up in some contexts a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? I'm going to check the laptop and see if there are any from the chat room. Be right back. We have a question here. It is, I'm a WAVE, W-A-V volunteer currently monitoring 3 streams, 2 in Southern Door. I noticed not much discussion with respect to other perennial that might be used. How might work and provide an option for allowing more sun for interplanted crops? Would you like me to repeat that? It's a kind of a long.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I am understanding the question.
Okay. This person is monitoring 3 streams and 2 in Southern Door County. I noticed there's not much discussion with respect to other perennials, I guess, that might be used. What might work, I guess, and provide an option for allowing more sun for interplanted crops, perennials.
Yeah, okay. The stream monitoring that we do at Spring Green campus, by the way, is through the Water Action Volunteers Network. So I'll throw in a plug for them because that's a pretty cool program. Yeah, so as we think about how trees impact the vegetation around them, that might be a crop, that might be forage, that might be pasture. There are a number of different studies into some trees that cast more or less dense shade, for instance. So for when you were mentioning, what trees do you plant or what trees do you plant the most of, in silvopasture, typically there are 3 or 4 species that tend to be planted, partly because they cast a dappled shade that doesn't shade out grass underneath them. Oak trees are great. Everybody loves oak trees. They tend to cast an extremely dense shade. So it's hard to grow and keep pasture happy under most. There are other species, honey locust is one that the grass or the pasture underneath the honey locust will go particularly well. That's also been explored in the context of alley cropping. So what trees can be grown near crops without impacting yield as much. And then I think we also need to think about what are we growing underneath trees. So for example, in an alley cropping system, the first 10 years of the system might be suitable for corn soybean rotation. Like I showed the picture of our demo site with the combine and the harvesting, I think, soybeans in the picture. That's corn this year. In 10 years from now or 20 years from now, a different crop might be more suitable as those trees mature and start casting more shade. We'll kind of explore that as the trees mature. But what we're growing under trees might change as the system develops. You might be able to get away with one system in a newly planted, right after you planted trees, one crop might continue to work, and then maybe you change crops and you grow something else as the trees start to mature. That's something we'll explore as we have more demonstrations out on the landscape.
There are no other questions online that I can see. Anyone else here in the audience have a question or comment? If not, Nate, anything else that you want to add before we just wrap things up?
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. Great to get up here. Madison was 88 degrees. It was incredible to watch the thermometer just drop as I drove north. So much more pleasant.
Thanks, Nate, very much.